By bringing Black radical history to the fore, Robin Kelley's work reminds us that the Black radical tradition is long and diverse. Spanning multiple Black movements such as those for reparations, gender justice, and third world liberation, his book, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, inspired the title for this conference. And then I'll say one quote, and then we'll welcome up Robin Kelley. Struggle is par for the course when our dreams go into action. But unless we have the space to imagine and a vision of what it means to fully realize our humanity, all the protests and demonstrations in the world won't bring about our liberation. Please join me in welcoming Robin D.G. Kelley.
Okay, let's see. Thank you, Emily. Okay, I have to say I'm a little bit. I was really moved by Malcolm's poem. You know, it was, and I was just I just had a little bit of tears and stuff because, you know, there's so many victims. There's so many, you know, and the fact that the Malcolm X grassroots movement has this study, it's like every, 28 hours basically, it's probably more than that. And so many young people. And as Gina Dent said today, and it was a wonderful session on Neoliberal University, like she meets so many young people, young Black men who actually were in college, in prison, who ended up leaving or could be in college or read a lot more than many of us. Anyway, so let me get to the business at hand because time is short. Before I do anything and say all my thank yous, I want to make a plug for the Roots and Remedies conference that's coming up. If you're interested in any of the issues that we are attending to in this conference, you want to register for Roots and Remedies in Detroit this year, July 18th through 20th. You can register, go to rootsandremedies.org. It's my sister's conference, praxisproject.org. My sister is a genius. If you don't know praxisproject.org, look it up, but you need to be there. I will try to be there myself so I could see you again. I also want to dedicate my remarks to the memory of many of those we lost recently. There's too many to name, but I think about what it meant to lose Chokwe Lumumba, what it meant to lose Amiri Baraka, to lose Jane Cortez, which has been over a year, but she's someone who was dear to my heart, Stuart Hall, Vincent Harding. I know Rachel Harding is here. Vincent was a mentor and a brilliant historian and just so many things. Rod Bush, whose memorial I'll be hosting next Sunday. Maya Angelou, of course, and General Baker, to name a few. I also want to honor those who are still with us. I mean, I think about Marion Kramer, who was General Baker's partner for almost 4 decades, longtime Detroit activist, a militant warrior on behalf of the dispossessed. And Grace Lee Boggs, who's still with us, whose birthday is coming up next month. Veterans like Dottie Zellner and Charlie Cobb and Julian Bond and many others, of course, who are here. And of course, Angela Davis, who I'm going to be talking about, whose work is, to me, the best example of what Gramsci actually meant when he talked about an organic intellectual. Because the organic intellectual means basically to develop modes of thought in the service of revolution and to be connected to movements for revolution. That is essentially the definition. And she's like my hero. So this is the 3rd time we've been in dialogue, and so I'm very excited about this. Now, right, the last 3 weeks. We've been on the road here, twice in LA. Okay, so of course, those of you who read Freedom Dreams know that all of the folks I mentioned who have passed on, the folks who are with us, and the movements with which they were associated profoundly shaped the book's ideas and the content. But for the purposes of this gathering, I just want to get us to think about General Baker and Angela, because they occupy a unique place. Why do I say that? Because for the first time I ever heard General Baker was 16 years ago, next month, at the founding convention of the Black Radical Congress. That was 16 years ago. I mean, this brings me back full circle to my main debt of gratitude and to the historical significance of this conference of Freedom Dreams, Freedom Now. And that brings me to Barbara Ransby. You have to realize something, and Barbara's not going to tell you this, but I'll say it, that there would be no Black Radical Congress if it hadn't been for Barbara Ransby, you know? And I know, because I was there. I was part of Ida Webb in those initial meetings. She did more than anyone to envision, promote, and usher in the Black Radical Congress. She needs to take credit for that, like all the credit, basically, and she hasn't been given her due. And I want to acknowledge that, and the reason why I want to acknowledge it now is because I see this conference as the extension of the Black Radical Congress. Okay, some of you are too young to know about that. It's amazing to think about that. I mean, I wasn't even young, you know, back in those days in 1998. So, you know, in some ways, it is the BRC, you know, like this conference, is one that really reflected on the political realities, the crisis, and the possibilities of the day. And it makes sense that Barbara and her students, the students involved in the social justice initiative, would be behind it, because she has long been one of the premier radical thinkers and activists of my generation. And I mean, it was evident, anyone who knew her even as an undergraduate knew that was the case. Okay, so I'm honored and humbled to have, you know, the Freedom Dreams as one of the frames for our 3-day discussion, and I see this as an opening created by the BRC, which could not have come into being without the radical organizing of the 80s and 90s. And yes, there was a lot of organizing in the 80s and 90s. That's another discussion, which couldn't have happened without the Black freedom movement of the post-war era, which could not have existed without the Black radical tradition. And let me hasten to add that none of these movements, initiatives, formations have limited their scope or vision to Black people, okay? Rather, they've been capacious and open, building solidarity with oppressed across the globe. So thank you, Barbara, for this. Now, I want to, with the time I have, address you know, what I fear might be a misreading of my book, Freedom Dreams. You know, and just to prepare you, because, you know, and this is my job. My job is to be hard, to think hard. My job's not to entertain you. If you want entertainment, you know, you could, you know, pay some money and go someplace for that. But this is about thinking. So by Freedom Dreams, I didn't mean taking a break from the day-to-day self-defense to dream of a different world, that a radical imagination is literally a kind of dream state. But rather, I meant that we cannot divorce critical analysis from social movements. Social movements, the challenges of solidarity, a deep understanding of mechanisms of oppression, and requirements for new modes of analysis. Okay? So it's not enough to imagine a world without oppression, which I really do want us to do, especially since, you know, we don't always recognize the variety of forms of modes of oppression that occur. I mean, this is part of the problem. You can't imagine a world without oppression unless you know all forms of oppression. And part of the education is learning what other forms of oppression that we can't see. But understanding the mechanisms or processes that not only reproduce structural inequality, but make them common sense, that render these processes natural or invisible. In other words, if anything, Freedom Dreams was a plea for what Mark Anthony Neal yesterday referred to as deep thought, as well as a kind of political archaeology of 20th century Black radical movements and Black radical visions of transformation. It's about how people in transformative social movements moved their ideas, shifted their ideas, rethought inherited categories, tried to locate and overturn blatant, subtle, and invisible modes of domination. Okay, let me slow down because I just realized, sorry about that, if you forgive me, because I want to make sure the translation comes across. Of course, there are too many examples of work that unveil these processes, it interrogates these categories, categories we continue to take for granted, like human, like people say, it's because you're human. Well, what does that mean? Race, power, gender, sex, security, law, crime, leadership, and even freedom. I have a list of names of people who I think do great work of interrogating that, but I don't want to name them because then I realize there are other people I should name and they'll be mad at me. So, but it's a long list and just really great work of people who do this. Okay, I'll give it a list, but if I don't name you, don't be mad at me, okay? But I begin with Angela Davis and Cedric Robinson and Beth Ritchie and Abunima and Silva and Erica Edwards and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Fred Moten and Roderick Ferguson and Asfana Najmabani, Jemima Pierre, Nairn Chandler, James Ford, a young cat in Occidental who you're going to hear a lot about, Shandan Reddy, Mishana Goldman, Sarah Ahmed, Jody Bird, and many, many more. In thinking about the need to rethink categories, I wanted to return to yesterday's discussion about pleasure and expressive cultures. If you weren't here, you'll follow me, but it was in a panel on culture. And the conversation was sort of like deja vu because a lot of those debates about what is pleasure, what is joy, we were having those in the 80s and 90s when cultural studies was taking off, and thanks to the influence of people like Stuart Hall and reading Antonio Gramsci. Let's see, I hope I didn't. The discussion yesterday kind of took a bipolar cast. On the one hand, it was presumed that the hegemony of capitalism is complete, it's totalizing. Like all the pleasures and all the desires are determined by the market. On the other hand, there's an opposition to that. That is that the oppressed are in a constant state of resistance, that expressive cultures are inherently, or worse, naturally oppositional. Now, the former underestimates our ability to think and overestimates the capacity of this abstract thing we call power to exercise its hegemony over us. So, as Stuart Hall famously said, hegemony is hard work. It's constant work to try to succeed at basically imposing domination. So we should not be surprised that expressive cultures have constructed an enforced hegemony by naturalizing ideas about nation, about class, about gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity. I mean, even before the advent of neoliberalism, the world's population had been transformed into producers and consumers of objects, made and disseminated for the benefit of others. The culture industry operates precisely to isolate individuals from each other, to destroy agency and community, to quarantine opposition, as well as deny fundamental change. And most importantly, to mask processes of neoliberalism behind the glossy facades. And I made this argument, I wrote this article you might have seen over the summer called Empire State of Mind, which kind of went viral and people got all upset because why are you talking about Jay-Z? Why are you talking about, well anyway. But that process, that article was about the way that these processes get masked. But even consumers of expressive culture don't always go for the okie doke, as Baraka would say. We know they can subvert the meaning and significance of political cultural forms for their own purposes. Now, the other position, that is that popular culture is inherently oppositional, and I remember a young brother had said something that he thought that hip hop is naturally revolutionary, and Dream Hampton's like, no, it's not. And I just thought that was a really important intervention on the part of Dream Hampton because, this position that popular culture is always oppositional not only underestimates hegemony, but it also underestimates our capacity to think in complex ways. It presumes that all thought and creativity and invention is structured by the conditions of oppression. Why give oppression that much power over us, right? And it's obsessed with resisting domination, and it's also ahistorical. I think this is what Dream Hampton and Mark Anthony Neal and Tony Bogues in a different way were trying to get at yesterday. What may be oppositional in one context may not be oppositional in another. What might be a source of collective pleasure may never have been intended to be oppositional, but if the state decides that whatever that thing is dangerous, that it's, deviant, say like the Zoot Suit in the 1940s, it becomes a site of contestation. What happens at that site is not predetermined, nor is it inevitable. And again, then this brings us back to the need for deep thought. We need to interrogate the terms and categories we use. For example, pleasure and joy were used interchangeably. And I was reminded of Gina Dent's path-breaking introduction to the text Black Popular Culture, which we need to go back to always, where she elaborates on Cornel West's distinction between pleasure and joy, where the former, pleasure, according to West, in a commodified world, tends to be inward and highly individuated, that's his words, where the latter can cut through market values and emphasize love, care, kindness, service, solidarity, the struggle for justice. In other words, as Cornell says, values that bring people together. And perhaps this is what Tony Bogues had in mind when he invoked what I believe was C.L.R. James's formulation of happiness. Though I wish, we heard more, because in our neoliberal era, Black happiness sometimes gets articulated as personal wealth, bling, good life, and all that stuff. That's not what Tony was talking about. Read C.L.R. James and you'll know what he's talking about. Read Tony Bogues and you'll know what he's talking about. But Gina Dent raises this distinction to a much higher level in ways I don't have time to explore, but hope you will go back to that essay. So among other things, Gina Dent takes the concept of joy as an elaboration and revision of the rebellious notion of women's pleasure coming from feminism and psychoanalysis. But placing this sort of rebellious notion in the context of Black movement. So she writes, like pleasure, joy still speaks, though not exclusively, to the locus of sensation and activity around which so much contemporary Black anxiety is produced, the erotic. But I refer to the erotic here not in its most general colloquial sense, but in the way that Audre Lorde has defined it, as our deepest knowledge, a power that, unlike other spheres of power, we all have access to, and that can lessen the threat of our individual difference, okay? So in the context of the constant policing of Black women's bodies, Black queer bodies, the pursuit of pleasure can be dangerous, a subversive thing, a source of empowerment. One of the greatest historical elaborations, of course, is Blues Legacies and Black Feminism. Obviously, by Angela Davis, for those of you who don't know. Okay. But just to be clear, I'm not retreating from the visionary project of building a new society, but just want us to be mindful of what it means to be mindful, to think through crisis toward revolutionary possibility. Consider SNCC's Freedom Summer, because that's what we're also celebrating, 50 years. We've all heard about the endless meetings and the long, hard work of building participatory democracy. But as Barbara Ransby clearly demonstrates, those long meetings, right, were not simply about consensus building, but rather forms of knowledge production, okay? There were collective interrogations into the problem, because you can't just assume that everyone knows in the context of Jim Crow what the problem is. There are mechanisms that are not so visible that people have to figure out and how to fight that, right? They were trying to understand processes and mechanisms of racist control, of political economy, and patriarchy, which was playing itself out in the organizing work. So this was the genius of Ella Baker's radical democratic vision. SNCC members did not give a series of monologues. They were engaged in dialogue, which is something I wish my students would do more often. Because they get up there and they just talk. They have their thing they want to say, and then they sit down. I'm like, why don't you talk to each other? That's hard work. Because to talk to each other means you have to listen. right? Okay? They were pushing each other's ideas to the limit. And there was also a level of transformation. So what happens in the end wasn't consensus building per se, but transformation. You come out the other end thinking differently than what you thought about before. That was the point of those. If I'm wrong, all the SNCC people tell me I'm wrong, correct me. But this is, to me, the genius of Barbara's book and why we have to go back to that as well. So, for example, we need to challenge the idea that the development of queer theories in understanding gender nonconformity is merely a product of our own evolved, sophisticated analysis of gender and sexuality, that we just got smarter, and we're just better than those other people. No, that's not how it happened. What happened was not some kind of march toward enlightenment, but rather a constant, uneven, complicated struggle against the mechanisms that make gendered inequalities, heteropatriarchy, heteronormative sexuality seem natural, organic, timeless. The processes of creating and reproducing the system of heteropatriarchy was a violent one. It was a violent process that even produced the system and intentionally masks histories that reveal that the so-called normative gender relations that we thought were always there were not always there. In most societies, what we think of as so-called normative gender relations are less than a century old. I mean, study Iran. I'm telling you, the idea that there's like two genders, that's modern. That's like less than 100 years. I mean, you have to go back and study the history to understand that. Inventing normativity is always a violent process. It requires policing. It requires a policing apparatus. And this is one of the many essential contributions that Beth Ritchie makes in her absolutely brilliant and stunning book, Arrested Justice. She writes about the state punishing norm violations such as adolescent pregnancy or any deviation from heterosexual nuclear families, right? She writes about the institutional regulations designed to intimidate people without power into conforming with dominant cultural expectations. For example, the idea that wage labor should replace the social safety net, like welfare reform. This neoliberal vision, in fact, was challenged by the very welfare activists that Pramila Natarajan writes about, and challenged. But these welfare activists actually expanded the welfare rolls and insisted on a guaranteed annual income. And there are many other examples. The point is, one cannot separate some abstraction called power from gender and sexuality, from race and nationality, et cetera. So this brings us to the final issue, which is, what is the meaning of freedom? Freedom is not self-evident. It's not. In fact, the whole point of my talk is that nothing is self-evident. You know what I'm saying? You know? Before freedom dreams, we have to know what we mean by freedom. And for this, I turn again to my hero and dear colleague, Angela Davis, who stands against the liberal tradition that understands freedom as the right of the individual to do what he wishes without fetters or impediments, as long as it is lawful under the state. This negative liberty or freedom places a premium on the right to own property, accumulate wealth, to defend property by arms, mobility, expression, and political participation. That's like the Hobbesian, notion of freedom. But Davis's conception of freedom is far more expansive and radical. Collective freedom, the freedom to earn a livelihood and live a healthy, fully realized life. Freedom from violence, sexual freedom, social justice, abolition of all forms of bondage and incarceration, freedom from exploitation, freedom of movement, freedom as movement, as collective striving for real democracy. For Davis, freedom is not a thing granted by the state in the form of law or proclamation or policy. Freedom is struggled for. It is hard fought. It is transformative, and it is a participatory process that demands new ways of thinking and being. So finally, Barbara asked me what I thought about the quilt as a metaphor, and it's powerful. Though I want to suggest something different from the way we typically see the scraps and patches of color as metaphor for solidarity across difference, and unity within difference, or communities reorganize to create new patterns and new possibilities. Instead, I want us to think in terms of the threads, okay? In terms of the processes that produce these pieces of cloth in the first place. The largely female and perhaps child labor in the garment industry, who worked or even manufactured the electric looms, picked cotton, either driving mechanical cotton pickers or by hand in China, India, Pakistan, Turkey, Brazil, and yes, the US South, the second largest producer of cotton still. In this neoliberal world, where creative destruction and privatization and immiseration is the order of the day, I hope we can imagine all the hands and eyes and minds that went into the quilt and went into picking cotton and turning it into thread, to recognize that how we are connected across the globe, that in order to realize our freedom dreams, there's a lot of work we have to do to dismantle not only the system, but its logics. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks, Dr. Kelley. Now I am honored to introduce Angela Davis, whose work has inspired so many of us on our activist journeys and has helped to push our radical politics even further. In works like Abolition Democracy and Our Prisons Obsolete, Angela pushes conceptual boundaries around the type of society we can imagine as possible and encourages us to see that our movements and struggles are interconnected. A quote from Abolition Democracy that frames well the themes of this conference and her activist background is, what we manage to do each time we win a victory is not so much to secure change once and for all, but rather to create new terrains for struggle. Angela is an educator who has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Please welcome Angela Davis to the stage.
Wow, it's really wonderful to see all of you gathered here this evening. And let me first acknowledge that this conference takes place on colonized land. And one of my freedom dreams is that we all develop what food justice activists call a deep sense of place. A deep sense of place. Robin talked about deep thought, and that's going to be one of the themes of my remarks as well. So that whatever we do, we never allow ourselves to forget the lasting effects of settler colonialism and its genocidal violence on the original inhabitants of this land. I was also really moved by the poets who preceded us. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much. And I want to pay tribute also to some of our comrades who have recently passed away, Stuart Hall and Amiri Baraka, and of course Vincent Harding, Maya Angelou, and Chokwe Lumumba, and all of the other comrades who've passed on. Robin mentioned Jane Cortez, and I saw the photograph of June Jordan. It was a photograph of me with June Jordan, and I cannot believe that she has been gone so long, but her spirit is still with us. I just met Karen Lewis in person. And I was telling her how excited I was. You know, I followed her on television, and last time I was in Chicago, I spoke about her. So this is really great. I want to thank Barbara Ransby and all of the members of the organizing committee who made this phenomenal gathering possible. You had an amazing vision, bringing activists together across generations, across what Barbara calls parallel worlds of activism, and across multiple concerns of these activisms, bringing us all together to look backwards in order to look forwards, in order to look forward toward new possibilities. That is to say, what some would consider impossible futures. And so now is the time to dream about impossible futures, about the conditions of possibility for the impossible. This is a very important historical conjuncture, and I use the word conjuncture as a nod towards Stuart Hall. If one looks at the rise of activisms, prison abolitionist activism, anti-capitalist activism, campaigns against heteropatriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, and the new energy we see in the struggles for Palestine solidarity. I am immensely honored by the fact that I've been asked to share this stage with Robin Kelley. I've known Robin since he was a graduate student. And of course, his fabulous book, Freedom Dreams, together with the SNCC slogan, Freedom Now, provides the thematic coherence of this conference. This is the third time Robin and I, as he said, have been on the same stage this month. The third time this month. And we're also going to be speaking together in about 10 days. When the African American Studies Department graduation happens. So I've been thinking that there must be some message to be detected in the fact that we've spoken together publicly 4 times during the course of a month. We have to talk about that, Robin. Last week we spoke, was that just last week? Yeah, it was last week. We spoke at an event that was organized by Students for Justice for Palestine on the UCLA campus. The week before, I spoke in the same venue where I gave the very first lecture of my academic career as a just hired, just fired assistant professor of philosophy. And we had a panel that included Robin Kelley, Cheryl Harris, and Rachel Herzing from Critical Resistance. And I can tell you that as I was speaking in Royce Hall, after being introduced by the current chancellor of UCLA, I was thinking that if you stay around long enough, if you are persistent long enough, you will be embraced by the very institution that banished you. But precisely at the moment when I felt that I was being embraced, I realized I had to think about how to extricate myself from the embrace of this institution, even as I recognized that it was a major victory of our struggle. So I absolutely love Robin's work. And I've been following, as I said, I've been following him since before he wrote his first book. before he wrote his dissertation, as a matter of fact. And I want to thank him publicly for providing the introduction, which I think is certainly the best part of the collection of talks published under the title, The Meaning of Freedom. And let me also say that Freedom Dreams is one of my most favorite works of all time. It has been 50 years since Freedom Summer. Since one of the most electrifying social justice experiments in our history, perhaps the only one that was more important, was radical Reconstruction. Young people, students, and workers of my generation answered the call to participate in that amazing campaign in Mississippi. And remember, there was no Facebook in those days. As a matter of fact, had there been social media, I would have heard about it in Europe, and I would have come home sooner. How slowly news traveled then, but how quickly young people responded to the call to travel to Mississippi in order to change the world, because that is what that campaign was about. I know that you have spent the last couple of days reflecting on that time and collectively imagining how we can turn our collective historical memory of that amazing moment into inspiration for our freedom dreams today, into an impetus to imagine ways of moving along new trajectories of liberation. One of the original architects of Freedom Summer, Bob Moses, has not given up. 50 years later, he is still running the Algebra Project, which brings mathematics to youth of color who live in impoverished community, and that is the way he chose to continue that struggle for freedom. I think it's important for us to recognize that there's not just one way. There are many ways. And Bob is passionate about mathematics. I've had conversations with him, and it's hard for me to understand that passion, but I witness it, and I think I understand why he made that choice. And all of us have to think in terms of passions that will allow us to continue to move along those trajectories indefinitely. And Bob encourages us to think deeply about the individualism that infects us, especially in this era of neoliberalism, to recognize that the individualism, the heroic individualism that is most frequently evoked as the motor of the mid-20th century freedom movement. We have these a few individuals, mostly. It tends to be male. The heroic individual is always gendered as male, and this process is a major impediment to understanding the extraordinary power of ordinary human beings. Ordinary human beings when they come together, and most importantly, when they imagine together and when they struggle together. We have been asked to reflect on the collective imagination, collective energy, and collective perseverance that brought down the laws of segregation and made it possible for Black people to exercise the civil rights that should have been accorded to us when slavery was abolished. And that's why we have to recognize that movement as the continuation of the abolitionist movement. As a matter of fact, instead of the civil rights movement, we might call it the 20th century abolitionist movement. We are also asked to harness the inspiration we experience when we revisit that moment 50 years ago, in order to recognize that we can imagine, we can dream, we can struggle. The nitty-gritty practice of politics often requires us to engage in compromise. And those of us who know anything at all about politics, we understand the importance of compromise. But there are times when compromise equals capitulation. And we should always remind ourselves that our dreams do not have to bear the imprint of compromise. During the summer of 1964, when Fannie Lou Hamer demanded that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party be seated at the Democratic Party convention, instead of the delegation being seated, and of course it would have taken the place of the white supremacist Democratic Party delegation, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegation was offered 2 seats. And so Fannie Lou Hamer, who many people witnessed giving this impassioned speech about the importance of voting rights and representation on television, she said, "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats." Because all of us is tired. We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats. They were demanding equality, and what was being offered to them was 2 seats. So 2 seats did not even begin to put us on the road to equality. Those struggles that came out of Freedom Summer inspired students at UC Berkeley to organize the free speech movement. And I'm thinking about Bettina Apteker and Mario Savio. I really love what Mario Savio said during one of his speeches on Sproul Plaza, inspired by what had happened during Freedom Summer in Mississippi and other parts of the South. He said, "There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. You've got to make it stop." And I think that reflects the spirit of that era. And we should recognize what it meant for young people all over the country to feel drawn to that project in Mississippi, to decide to spend their vacation facing the Ku Klux Klan. They knew exactly what they were facing. And of course they experienced the violence that led to the murder of 2 of the young men who had come down, and one young man who lived in Mississippi. Now we've learned a great deal since that period. We've learned how to envision struggles for racial justice very broadly. We know that struggles for racial justice are not only for people of African descent, but of Asian, Latin American, Middle Eastern descent. We know that anti-Muslim racism is one of the most virulent forms of contemporary racism. And we know that all of these racisms are rooted in the genocide of colonization inflicted on indigenous people. So we think broadly, and we think deeply. We didn't actually decide to make thinking deeply the themes of our remarks, but this is what is required today. And as I said earlier, we always need a deep sense of our struggle so that we don't make the mistake of assuming that we start right now, as if we today produce the only histories that matter. You know, I was reading a really interesting, teaching a really interesting anthology by Alkan and Ajiman on food justice and sustainability. And in one of the articles, there's a description of a young woman who is this really impassioned vegan, impassioned organic farmer, and she talks about decreasing her footprint, her carbon footprint. And then someone asked her, well, do you know anything about the farming practices of the native people in this area? And her response was, oh, I know organic farmers, but I don't think I know any Indian farmers. Absolutely no sense. But also, no sense. No sense. Because in order to have sense, you have to have deep sense. Deep sense. And yeah, and I can't deviate from my notes too much because I only have a few more minutes left. Oh wow, okay, and this sense of ourselves as individuals. She was only concerned with her own individual footprint, and in the process, she was replicating the very individualism that neoliberalism uses to prevent us from imagining ourselves as communities, as collectives, as empowered people. So how long have black people raised the slogan of 40 acres and a mule? I mean, we've been talking about getting our 40 acres and a mule for, the last 150 years, right? But why did we not learn how to question the legitimacy of claiming land that belonged to someone else? So whose 40 acres were they to begin with? And so as we move forward, we have to look backward. And therefore demands for reparations, and Robin has a really wonderful history of the reparations movement in Freedom Dreams, in the chapter that's called Day of Reckoning, Dreams of Reparation. But demands for reparation will have to rest on a deep awareness of settler colonialism and on its foundational role in the production of U.S. democracy. We've been urged by Barbara and the Planning Committee to think about what they call the 4 Ps. Prisons, as in prison industrial complex. Poverty, as in produced by capitalism. Patriarchy, as in heteropatriarchy. And Palestine, as in the contemporary struggle against apartheid and settler colonialism. We've been urged to think deeply about these modes of oppression and repression. And I think the alliterative associations of the 4 Ps are designed to encourage us to think about their deeper structural linkages and how they coincide and overlap and intersect. How do we think together prisons, poverty, patriarchy, and Palestine, and how can our freedom dreams reflect a capacity to think complexly, as well as how to our capacity rather to popularize complicated analyses. Complicated analyses are not only or primarily for the academic. As a matter of fact, oftentimes what academics assume to be complicated analysis are actually really simple. But we need complexity. We need complexity, and we need to be able to figure out oftentimes how to translate that complexity, how to make that complexity accessible. And so prisons. So I have a last section that's prisons, poverty, patriarchy, and Palestine. Prisons. There was a New York Times editorial on the 24th of this month on mass incarceration. And I guess most of you saw the editorial, right? Right? And so the editorial concludes this way: the research is in, and it is incontestable. The American experiment in mass incarceration has been a moral, legal, social, and economic disaster. It cannot end soon enough. Okay, that's the New York Times. And they're really just playing catch up. You know. I mean, I don't know why we get so happy when the New York Times comes up with an editorial like that. It's like they came up with the idea in the first place. They didn't. We've been talking about this for decades. But I think it is important that they feel obligated now to admit it. But it's not so simple. Because it's not only about prisons in the U.S. It's not only about, and I think the term mass incarceration is important and has led to a great deal of organizing, but we have to go further than that. It's not just about putting a lot of people in prison. You know, it's about a whole system, and this is why we attempted to introduce the term prison industrial complex so that we could think in a more complicated way about the work that prisons do, not only in the U.S., but all over the country, throughout the global north, but also increasingly in the global south as a direct inheritor of structural adjustment. And of course, the connection with immigration policies and practices, with violent repression against immigrants, not only here, but in Europe, and also in Africa. And as a matter of fact, as many of you know, the private prison corporations have made it very clear that they consider immigrant detention as the most profitable sector of private prisons. And so we have to think about the question of prisons in a much more complicated way. And I brought this book up that just came off the presses, and I see one of the editors, Liat Ben Moshe, I just saw you. Where did I see you? Oh, right there. Yeah, I just saw you. Is here, and many of you heard her yesterday. But this anthology helps us to think about the work of the prison, the work of incarceration in an even more complicated framework. And we see how the incarceration of disabled people over the decades and centuries has actually helped to shape the way in which incarceration functions in the in a larger context in the U.S. and throughout the world. So it's only $25, and I think there's a few left. So you better hurry if you want to get one of the very first copies of this amazing anthology. This is about complicating our analysis and not being satisfied with the way in which our work is given back to us. It's given back to us in a certain way by the New York Times, and we are invited to celebrate that. What we have to do instead is to strategize where we go from here. Patriarchy. No, I miss poverty. Poverty. And in terms of poverty, I wanted to talk about the promise of the Occupy movement. I think it's so important for those of us who are serious about changing the world to use the promises of certain historical conjunctures. Those promises do not have to go away, even though the moment is past. The promise of radical reconstruction is still with us today. The promise of Occupy resides in the fact that for the first time since perhaps the 1930s, we were allowed to propose open critiques of capitalism. And let's not forget that. If we cannot bring critiques of capitalism into our work, our scholarly work, our activist work, then we will be forever under the spell of this system that thrives on exploitation and racism and patriarchy. And speaking of patriarchy, let me say that I was recently reading Angela Harris's article, which is called Heteropatriarchy Kills. And she focuses largely on sexual violence in men's prisons and the production of what Terry Kupes calls toxic masculinities. And reading that work, I thought about an experience I recently had at the University of Southern Illinois, Carbondale, speaking with a group of young black men who are students there. First of all, I didn't realize that there are more black students at the University of Southern Illinois than there are at most HBCUs, because it's like, what is it, about 40% black, the population of the university? And so this group of young men created this organization called Progressive Masculinities. And this group of young black men who are trying to learn how to be men in a very different way. And what they do is first of all, they work at the Women's Center. They do rape crisis work. They are involved in a major campaign against sexual assault. And it occurred to me that some years ago, the promise for this kind of activism could be seen in an organization in D.C. that emerged around the same time as, what was the first black, Beverly knows, the anti-rape organization in the country. It was in D.C., that Loretta. D.C. Rape Crisis, exactly. And around that time, a group of black men in D.C. decided that they would also take on the task of confronting sexual violence. This was back in the 70s. And so one would have thought that by the 21st century, there would be huge numbers of men engaging in the work of eradicating sexual violence. But that hasn't happened. And so I see these young men in Carbondale, and I promised them that I would talk about them, planting ideas in other geographical spaces. They are the promise that we witnessed in the early 70s. Now, Palestine, the last P, Palestine. It seems to me that our goal today has to be to incorporate Palestine into every progressive and radical social justice agenda in the country. That is what we have to do. Just as the eyes of the world, all of the eyes of the world were once focused on South Africa, they should be focused on Palestine today. We who believe in freedom should not rest. And certainly we cannot rest as long as Israel engages with impunity in the repression of Palestinian people and remains the only settler colonial state in the world that continues to expand, that is trying to expand. And here in Chicago, we need to be thinking about Razmia. And you know that she received, Razmia Youssef O'Day received the Outstanding Leader Award. And less than a year ago, she was arrested by Homeland Security agents, charged with unlawful procurement. Can you imagine what she unlawfully procured? Unlawful procurement of naturalization. Unlawful procurement of nationalization. And this is because she failed to explain on her application that she had been arrested, by the Israeli government, and that she had been tortured. And hearings are happening now in Detroit. They moved the case to Detroit precisely because of the fact that there's a huge community here in Chicago. So one of the tasks confronting us is to make sure that that community is remade in Detroit, whether it means people traveling to Detroit or doing organizing in Detroit to guarantee that every time she goes to court, the courtroom is full. And in general, we have to learn how to stand up and overcome the fear of being targeted if we speak out. As long as we allow that fear to immobilize us, we will continue to be targeted when we speak out. So we have to learn how to stop engaging in self-censure. I think that's a major task today. So let me wind up. I know I've gone over time. Barbara wrote to Robin and me. She said, "Why are freedom dreams so important as we continue to engage in the concrete work of response and resistance to oppression?" I am assuming that you will both mention prisons, Palestine, poverty, and patriarchy. But if you had a room full of 500 activists in front of you looking for a deeper analysis and greater sense of connection to one another, what would you say? Okay. So I thought about that, and I was actually quite surprised that my thoughts almost instinctively focused on a very early period of my life when I was not yet 20, when I was a burgeoning activist. I had this thirst to think beyond my own circumstances. I wanted to know about much more than what I had directly experienced in Birmingham, Alabama, in New York, in Boston. So I went, I left Birmingham and I went to New York. I went to the Northeast. And then I went to France. And in France, I made contact with Algerian activists. And I came to embrace the Algerian Revolution. and from there, the larger continent of Africa, and then Asia, and then Latin America, and then the world. And so my dreams are now that we extricate ourselves from our self-imposed provincialism. My dreams are about a deeper consciousness. They are about transforming the way we think about ourselves and each other. They are about extricating ourselves from the U.S.-centric provincialism which imprisons us. They are about creating new habits of consciousness. They are freedom dreams about making connections across worlds. Thank you very much.